All right, let's get underway. Joshua chapter 10. Let's review where we've been, the first 9 chapters. Chapter 1 was Joshua prepares for the conquest. Chapter 2 sent spies to Jericho. Chapter 3 was crossing over the Jordan. And then chapter 4 was the memorial stone set up in 2 places, one in the middle of the river and the other they carried with them when they came to Gilgal. The second generation was circumcised once they got to Gilgal. And then they took Jericho in chapter 6. There was the failure in chapter 7, the defeat at Ai because of Achan's sin. And then chapter 8 dealt with the victory at Ai. And then chapter 9, there was the treaty with the Israelites, wherein they did not consult with the will of the Lord on the matter. Well, that's the first 9 chapters. We're ready for chapter 10. 3 major sections to the book. We're across the river in chapters 1 to 5. We're in this middle section of conquering the enemy. And that'll get us through chapter 12. Now, we'll be a couple of weeks finishing that, and then we'll be into the claiming of the inheritance. There are 3 campaigns, as generally it's viewed. There was the central campaign. We'll say more about that in a moment, taking Jericho, Ai, and Gibeon. And then there's the southern campaign, which is covered in chapter 10, 1 chapter devoted to that. And then chapter 11 is the northern campaign. When we come to chapter 12, it's just a list of the kings that were defeated. And we'll say more about that here in just a second and start listing some of those kings. All right, let's talk about chapter 10. Question number 1 for tonight is, write a short summary of chapter 10. That would be our chapter title, which is The Conquest of the South. Now, I want to take just a moment to look at how the conquest took place. There's a couple of things that impress us, 2 or 3 things that impress us as we have gotten thus far, and by the time we get to the end of chapter 10. One is, obviously, we saw in chapter 6, we saw it in chapter 8, we see it also here in chapter 10, that any victory they have is through the power and the strength of God. God's the one leading them in this victory. Without God, they have no victory. Without God, they are defeated, as we saw in chapter 7. Another thing that impresses us is the military strategy. Of course, God's the one leading them, so however they went. If they decided to start at the top and work their way down, or at the bottom and work their way up, God was with them and God would have accomplished this. But it seems to be that we know what they did. There was a central campaign first. They come in and took Jericho and Ai, and now Gibeon is no longer an enemy but an ally with them. And then they took off to the south, and then they went to the north. We'll see. So the southern campaign in chapter 10, and chapter 11 there's the northern campaign. Why is that? Well, it seems to be to divide the land right through the middle and get that under their control. And then goes to the south and gets that under their control, and then goes to the north. Rather than having the north being able to come to the south, they've got the middle under their control by the time they get to the south. Seems to be a military strategy that they're following. Another thing that's also interesting, every little city that they may come across, there's no indication they took every city and killed every person in every city. But they took major cities to the point, now they eventually were to drive the people out. That's true. Deuteronomy had said that. But in the campaign of settling in the land, there's no indication that they took every single city they came across, but took major cities so that they have the land under their control. Make sense? And we'll see perhaps more about that a little bit later. Another map showing the same kind of thing, marking it out. They have already taken and conquered the land on the east side of the Jordan when they killed Sihon and Og. And now they took Ai and Gibeon and Jericho, and so they occupy the middle section of the land. And tonight we're looking at that southern campaign, so they're taking the southern area. So when we get through tonight, this is what they've conquered. Next week, then they take in the northern part of the land of Palestine, and they are ready then to start settling into the tribes. And we'll see more about that a little bit later. So let's go back to our outline of chapter 10 and start our way through. Here's 5 things that happened in the chapter. There are 5 Amorite kings that fought against Gibeon and Israel. Graded ages, there's an answer right there to one of your questions. So there are 5 Amorite kings that fought against them. Then we have Israel gain victory over the Amorite kings. The sun stood still while Israel fought. Then there are 5 kings that were killed. Now they were conquered up here, but now they're killed down in 16 to 27. And then we have the victory of the south completed and the victory over 7 other kings. Now, so let's talk about Question number, let's go through verses 1 to 5, and then we'll come back to our questions. Let's work our way through the first 5 verses and talk about some things on the mount a little bit. So here's the king of Jerusalem, mentioned in verse 1, Adoni-Zedek. There's Zedek. He had heard that Joshua had taken Ai and utterly destroyed it, and also what he'd done to Jericho, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with them. And so what's his problem with that? Well, he don't want to be conquered, number one, nor does he want any other city making a treaty with them. In other words, if they make a treaty like Gibeon did, then they're going to fight along with Israel. And so as they go to take on more, they're going to be an aid and help to Israel, so their lives would be spared. He doesn't want any other city doing the same thing. So if he can make his way toward Gibeon and defeat Gibeon, that teaches a lesson to all the other cities that think about making some kind of treaty with Israel. And so they greatly feared, verse 2, that because Gibeon, a great city, one of the royal cities, because it was greater than Ai, with all of its mighty men, therefore this king of Jerusalem, he sent to 4 other kings. So there was Hoham, the king of Hebron. There was Piram, the king of Jarmuth, and Japhia, the king of Lachish, and Debir, the king of Eglon. And so those were the 4 kings. Now let's go ahead and finish that, and we'll talk about where these kings were, or where they were located. And so he came up, and he said, come up with me, and let's attack Gibeon. Why not attack Israel? Well, he seems to be wanting to teach Gibeon, not only Gibeon a lesson, that's not really his point, as he is trying to teach the other cities the lesson that they should not do what Gibeon did. So notice at verse 4, we're going to attack Gibeon, for it had made peace with Joshua and the children of Israel. So they should have fought against Israel instead of making peace. Let's teach them a lesson, but let's also teach mainly the other cities around, don't make peace with Israel because we're going to make war with you. So we've got an alliance of 5 kings here that are going to do that. Now let's go over here to another map. And here are some of the places that we have identified here of these kings. Not that that's greatly that important, but let me give you a kind of a perspective of where we're talking about. Here is Gilgal, not far from Jericho. Gilgal is right here at the end of my little arrow, and then here's Jericho there. And Ai is not that far off, closer over here to Bethel. So the campaign thus far has taken place in this region, right up in this area. And the general thought is they're going to come south. So we're going to go fight against them, and let's see what happens. So here's Jerusalem, the king of Jerusalem. The king of Jerusalem is one of the kings. Then there is one from, where's my next city? Hebron. Hebron is right here. Here is Eglon, one of the cities. Here is Lachish, one of the other cities. And Debir down in this region. And Jarmuth is right here. So the kings down in this area decide, we're going to go up and fight against Gibeon, and maybe we'll put a stop to this advancement. So question number 2, what 5 kings? It's those 5 kings that are identified right here in verse number 3 and 4, 3, and then again at verse 5. So the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon are the ones that come and they're ready to fight against Gibeon. And so they launch their attack. Now, notice at the end of verse 5, they camped before Gibeon and made war against it. Again, it's interesting they didn't go to Gilgal and try to defeat Israel. That's not, they want to do that, but that's not what they're after. They're trying to keep this thing from spreading as it happened with Gibeon. All right, let's get back to our outline. And notice starting at verse 6, Israel gained victory over the armies of the kings. Israel in verses 6 through 11. Let's see how that happened. The men of Gibeon sent to Joshua, who's gone back and set up camp at Gilgal. That's where he was when he came out to Ai, when he came to the Gibeonites, and that's where he's gone back. That's home base for him right now. And so they've gone back there, or that is Joshua and the fighting men have gone back. So they send word to him, and do not forsake your servants. In other words, remember the treaty we made, and don't let us down. Come to us quickly, because the kings of the Amorites who dwell in the mountains have gathered against us. And so Joshua ascended to Gilgal, from Gilgal, and all the men of war, the people of war, and the mighty men of valor. So Joshua and his army take off, and they go up to Gibeon. Now at verse 8, Graded Ages, here's the answer to one of your questions. The Lord said to Joshua, do not fear them, for I have delivered them into your hand. Not a man of them shall stand before you. Now that phrase was used in chapter 6, and it was used again in chapter 8, but it wasn't used in chapter 7, to my knowledge. And if you can find it there, then I'll just say I was wrong and I'll stand corrected. And want to be corrected if I'm wrong about that. But what's interesting is in Joshua 6, God said, I have given into thy hand Jericho. In other words, I've given it to you. Here's the assurance. But it was conditional, and they met the conditions. They did it right, and they got the city. Well, in Joshua 7, God did not say, I have given Ai into your hand. They go and try to take Ai. Not that God didn't want them to take Ai, but they didn't do it right. And God never gave them the promise, I have given that to you. But in chapter 8, God did say that and use that phrase. And here he uses that phrase again. And so I'm learning a very practical thing about God's assurance. When God says, I've done something, and it's always past tense. I think that's called prophetic perfect, when God speaks of things that are not as though they are, like Romans 4. God speaks of the future in past tense because of the assurance that's going to take place. Well, God's done that with you. When he talks about giving eternal life, and he mentions it in past tense at times. It's the assurance that God will give that. It's done, it's finished, even though it's yet in the future. But be that as it may, verse 9, Joshua, therefore, came suddenly upon, and there was a number of occasions, I don't have the references before me, where Joshua, sometimes the battle was into the mountains, sometimes it was in the foothills, and sometimes Joshua suddenly came up on a battle. And this was one of those where he knew he was going, but he suddenly came upon them, according to verse 9. And so the Lord, here's the Lord's instrumentality of the Lord being involved in this. He routed them before Israel and killed them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and chased them to the road that goes down to Beth Horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. All right, let's go back to our map just for a moment. This map right here. And here is Azekah. And if I'm pronouncing those wrong, those who know the proper pronunciation, and Makkedah, feel free to correct me on that. But in other words, here's the point I want you to see. Gibeon is on up this way. It's not on this map. It's on up this way a little ways. And these kings from the south are coming. And so these kings are driven downhill. The mountain range is running right along in this area. And so they're pushed down the mountainside or down the hillside. And they're pushed away. And so they're running and they're fleeing from them. Now notice at verse 11 that as they fled on the descent of Beth Horon, that the Lord cast large hailstones from heaven. Here's divine intervention. The Lord's with them. The Lord's driving them out. The Lord is causing them to kill them. But the Lord gives them a hand here, and he does two things. Here's the first, and that is he caused large hailstones to come from heaven, so that more died from the hailstones than were killed with the sword. So more were killed in this battle of these 5 kings coming in. And this battle lasted for a little bit, and we'll talk more about that next week. But more are killed from the hailstones, large hailstones that the Lord caused to fall from heaven, than were killed with the sword. Now that gets us through verse 11 of defeating those kings. Now those kings aren't killed. We're going to say more about those kings in just a moment, but those kings haven't been killed. They've been captured, as we're going to see in just a moment. They've been captured, but they haven't been killed. So Israel gained victory over them. Now the battle's not over. Let's move now, and is really a part of this victory here that could be outlined a little differently. 12 to 15, the sun stood still. We're going to stop and talk about the sun standing still for a little bit. So here was the second thing that the Lord did, beginning at verse 12 through verse 15. That Joshua spoke to the Lord that day. Now notice this is not the Lord speaking to Joshua, but the that Joshua spoke to the Lord that day when the Lord delivered the Amorites before the children of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, "Sun, stand still over Gibeon." So during this battle, now we're backing up a little bit in time, where verse 11 had ended as the battle's over and they've captured the kings. So we're backing up. What happened in the middle of that fight? Well, while that fight's going on, Joshua had said, "Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon." So the sun stood still. Now, verse 13 is more not a quotation from Joshua as it is what happened as a result of what Joshua had said. This seems to be a quote from the book of Jasher. We'll say more about that in a moment. But the sun stood still, and the moon stopped till the people had revenge upon their enemies. Now that would be an aid to them. Now, how did that happen? We'll get to in a moment. And was that literal, or was that something that was figurative, or was it some kind of imagery that was involved? We'll get to that in a moment. But the point is that if the sun stays up for a longer period of time and it never goes down, they can have longer and greater victories. So instead of having a nightfall, they can fight all day. They can fight through the night and fight throughout the next day. So the sun stood still for a day. We'll see that at end of verse 13. It's written in the book of Jasher. What was that book? Some have thought, some of our critics, I'm talking about biblical modernists who criticize the Bible and are critics of the Bible, have thought that's one of the lost books of the Bible that we're missing. There's no evidence of that. It seems to be an uninspired writing of the time, as I often quote from uninspired writers. I quote from Barnes quite frequently, and I quote from R.C. Trench and A.T. Robertson and Warren Wiersbe, J. Sidlow Baxter, Homer Haley, and others. Those are uninspired writers. And so this is a record that was made, a historical record that was made in the book of Asher, and uninspired, but it was written in the book. And the text says, "So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day." Now let's stop and talk about that for a little bit. First, let's talk about what that did for the battle. Again, emphasize that the Lord did two things to help them in this battle. The Lord didn't help them in Joshua 7, but He did help them, nor did He do much for them in Joshua 9 when they made a treaty with the Gibeonites. But the Lord had done much for them in chapter 6 and chapter 8 in two victories, and now He's doing something for them as they defeat all these kings of the south. And so two things that He did: God brought hailstone upon them and killed a bunch of them, and then so they can slaughter even more, the sun stood still for about a day. Now, that's another area wherein the critics have a great deal to say about the book of Joshua, and the book of Joshua can't be true. The book of Joshua is a farce. It can't be inspired because everyone knows the sun could not stand still, and the sun did not stand still. And others think, well, the Bible, it is inspired, but it's not literal. So let's talk about that for a little bit. Did the sun literally stand still? And some think, well, that can't be. No way the sun could stand still at all. That's impossible. Two or three things I would list for you. Number one, God, who could miraculously create the universe out of nothing and could supernaturally stop the sun and make the sun stand still for a period of a day. If He can take the rib of a man and make a woman from that and create the world from nothing and speak and say, "Let there be light," and there is light, then God, if there is God and there is, could cause the sun to stand still. So it's not a problem for a Bible believer to believe that. Secondly, how God caused the sun to stand still, we're not told, nor does it matter to us. We have to accept it as a fact. God did. I don't know how God turned 5 loaves and 2 fishes into enough to feed 5,000. How did He do it? It was miraculously. I know that, but how did He do it? Did one fish turn into 2 fish, and every time He reached for another? I don't know. I don't know how that happened. I don't know how He did it. I just know He did it. And I accept that. How did Jonah survive in the belly of a great fish? I don't know. How did God cause that? How did he breathe and live down? I don't know. I don't know. I don't have to know. So how did God do this? And books have been written on analyzing how the sun could have stood still for a day. I don't know. The text doesn't tell us. A third thing. The book of Joshua is a historical book. It is not a book that's written in signs and symbols and visions and figures like Zechariah, Ezekiel, like parts of Daniel chapter 7 to 12, or like the book of Revelation. So if we found a phrase like this in Revelation, we might say, that probably is figurative because it fits into that narrative. The book of Joshua is a historical book. There's nothing in Joshua 10 to tell us it's figurative or symbolic. Now, another matter about the sun standing still. So my conclusion has to be that literally happened. The sun stood still. It is not something that is poetic. It is not something that is inaccurate. It's something that really did happen. But here's a fourth thing about that. One of the arguments is the sun is not moving. It's the earth that's moving. And so the sun couldn't have stood still because the sun, everything's rolling around. So the sun isn't moving at all. And so that is not a literal thing because the sun's not moving anyway. But the Bible approaches the sun, and other matters for that matter, with the language of appearance, how things appear. There is no inaccuracy. In fact, let's go over to chapter 12 in verse 1. Let me give you an example of that. Chapter 12 in verse 1 talks about these are the kings. We'll get to this next week. These are the kings of the land whom the children of Israel defeated and whose land they possessed on the other side of the Jordan toward the rising of the sun. Well, the sun doesn't really rise, does it? We talk about the rising of the sun, but the sun isn't rising. The earth is rotating. But the Bible, in fact, 54 times in the Bible, there is this phrase, the rising of the sun. But the sun doesn't really rise. That's the language of appearance. That's how it appears from man's standpoint. And from the man's standpoint on earth, the sun stood still. So did God cause the earth not to rotate? Or did he cause the sun to shine around the entire world? Even though the earth was rotating? I don't know what he did. But the fact that the sun doesn't literally rise doesn't keep the Bible from describing it from the language of appearance of how it appears to man. And the same thing with the sun standing still here. And we could go further on the sun standing still, but if I did, I'm going to have to make up some stuff because I've told you all I know. So we're going to stop with what I know on that. All right. That's the sun standing still. No reason to question that as critics say the earth did not stand still. All right, that gets us to verse 15. Psalm 50 and verse 1 is another reference. If you were writing references where it talks about the rising of the sun, the language of appearance. But you can look that phrase up 54 times. That kind of language is used. Let's talk about 5 kings were killed, 16 to 27 now. Let me stop before we do that. Let's catch up on some questions here. Question number 3 for the adults. Let's get that first, and we'll go to the graded ages. How was Israel victorious over the Amorites, 6 to 11? God was with them, and God killed them with hailstones. That's how they were victorious. Question number 4, what do we know about the book of Jasher? It's an uninspired writing of the time. That's all we know. Question 5, did the sun stand still really? Or was it a poetic statement for emphasis? It really did happen. All indication is that it really did happen. All right, graded ages. Let's see, we may have a couple of questions to catch up on. What did God tell Joshua about the battle? Verse 8, he told him not to fear, but I've given them into your hand. Question 3, the answer is hailstone. What did God use to kill more? And question number 4, what did God do when Israel, to give Israel more time, the sun stood still. All right, let's look at verses 16 to 27 now. Let's talk about the 5 kings being killed. Now, that's the 5 kings that had joined together to fight Gibeon. These are those 5 kings. So let's start at verse 16 now. Let me get my pages sticking together here. Let me go back to verse 14. Let me comment on verse 14. I didn't get down. I commented on 13. Verse 14 said, still talking about the setting of the sun or the sun standing still, there had been no day like that before or after it. Now that gives me a greater argument that it is literal, that it really did take place. If it was some kind of illusion, then why wasn't there a day like that before or after? If it didn't really stand still, and things continued as they were, or there wasn't the sun shining for all day and all night, then why wasn't there a day like that before or a day after? The text says there wasn't a day like that before, and there hasn't been a day like that since. That was a one-time event. And another point to be made at verse 14, that the Lord heeded the voice of man, for the Lord fought for Israel. There's a sermon within that. The Lord heeding the voice of man because he fights for us. The Lord's fighting for you. And the Lord will heed your voice. Whatever you're fighting, whatever you're dealing, it may be sorrow that you're fighting. It may be temptation that you're fighting. It may be struggles in the home. It may be error that you're trying to fight against. It may be the pressures of work. And as long as it's a battle that's fighting for the Lord's fighting for you, and the Lord will heed your voice, for the Lord fights for Israel. Practical thing to learn from verse 14. Then Joshua went back to the camp of Gilgal. Now let's start at verse 16. Let's talk about the 5 kings being killed. Those 5 kings that fled came to the cave at Makkedah, or Makkedah. They were told to Joshua that the 5 kings had been hidden in a cave. So Joshua rolled a large stone at the mouth of the cave, so the men and set men by it to guard it, and told them, "Do not stay yourselves, but pursue your enemies." This is while the battle is still going on. So the sun has stood, and they're fighting their battle. This is not after everything's been settled on that. While the battle is still going on, they come to Joshua and said, those kings have been captured. We put them in a cave. Well, he says, put a stone there, set a guard, and y'all go on and fight. The fight's still on. Don't ever let up in the fight. Something practical to learn. Verse 19. Do not allow them to enter the cities, for the Lord God has delivered them into your hand. We're pursuing an enemy. Go get them, go kill them, go defeat them. Don't let them get any further, because God has promised them into our hand. So then at verse 20, that while Joshua and the children of Israel made an end of the slaying with great slaughter, that the people returned to the camp, and they came back to Makkedah in peace, that is, having conquered, and no one moved his tongue against any of the children of Israel. No one criticized what was being done, what had been done. Then then Joshua said, open the mouth of the cave, bring out the kings, and they brought them out, and the kings then are listed again. Those are the same 5 kings. And they brought them out, and he told the captains of the war to come near and put their feet on the necks of the kings. Now that's interesting. One writer observed that, and whether there's a big significance to this or not, I don't know, but the idea, I know this part is true, that to put your foot on the neck of a king, for example, a king that has been captured, to put your foot on the neck of a king shows superiority, and you have conquered that king. You have defeated that king. That king is now under your foot. That's the idea. And he calls the captains to come over. Notice Joshua doesn't go do that himself. Joshua doesn't do that out of arrogance. Joshua doesn't come and he wants to be the one that's got the photo op picture of, I'm standing here with my foot on the neck of these kings, but he wants these kings defeated. But Joshua's not interested in having his foot up on the foot on the neck of the kings. Come and put your neck on your foot on the neck of the kings, and they drew near and put their feet there. And then he told them to be not dismayed. That's the same thing was said in chapter 1 and verse 9. Don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged. And he said, the Lord will do to all your enemies against whom you fight. This is a lesson to be learned. This is a teaching moment. And so Joshua struck them and killed them, and they hung them on 5 trees, the text says. And so when evening come, they took them down and put them in the cave and sealed the cave, and that's where they are. All right, that gets us through verse 27. So those 5 kings are slaughtered. And that's interesting because they were trying to avoid being slaughtered. They're trying to avoid being captured, and that's exactly what happened to them. They were captured, and they were slaughtered, and they are defeated. Let's see if we can get the rest of the chapter. 28 to 43 is the largest section of the chapter. This is the victory of the south is completed, and with the victory over 7 other kings. There's 7 listed here, but some of those are the cities where these kings had been that we just defeated. So it's not a total of 7. That's a little misleading for us. I want to jump ahead and get the conclusion, then come back and see how we got there. Let's go to verse 40. You might underline, so Joshua conquered all the land. Graded ages, your last question deals with that. Question 8 for the adults. The question is, how well did the southern campaign go? It went real well. Joshua conquered all the land. How was it worded for the graded ages? How much of the land did Joshua conquer in the south? All of it. All that God wanted him to take, God allowed him to take it. And so they got it all. So it wasn't that they got 50% or 60 or 70% and they did pretty good. I mean, that's not bad. They got it all because God was with them. All right, now it's not going to take us long to work through this section. So let's see what we've got. Verse 28, you might underline the cities that were taken. Joshua took Makkedah and struck down its king with the edge of the sword and destroyed it. So they've conquered that city. Again, we're getting the picture. These are major cities. Let's go back to our map that we had just a moment ago. And some of these major cities that are here to the south, he's not taking every little village, but some of the major cities like Jerusalem, like Hebron, like Makkedah or Lachish, etc. He's taking those cities. So that's a city that was taken. Go back to my questions here. Then there is, that was a city that didn't involve the king. Then there was Libnah. At verse 29, you might underline, they came to Libnah and they fought against Libnah, and the Lord delivered it into their hands. The next city, verse 31, is Lachish. We come across Lachish several times in the Old Testament. A great deal of work has been done at Lachish in recent years. By recent, I'm talking about the last 25, 30 years. Excavation and archaeological work there. The next one is at verse, and Lachish was one of the cities that was mentioned back over here at verse 5. So that king has already been killed, but he comes in and captures the city. Make sense? So the fighting men had come out to Gibeon, and he killed the king, and many of the fighting men come back and take the city now. So when we're talking about all that we're capturing, that's what we're talking about. Look at verse 34. Eglon, that's another one of the cities that has already been mentioned. Hebron is mentioned at verse 36. They came to Hebron. That was one of the cities already mentioned. And then they came to Debir, which is down at the very bottom, and conquered it. So all of these cities that are mentioned here, there's, I think there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 that are mentioned, and outlined 7 additional. That's not actually 7 additional. 7 total cities were taken, and take 3 from that 7. So what is that? That's 4 additional kings that were taken of a total of 7 that are mentioned there of those that were conquered. Now let's go on down to verse 40 now. We've got a list of the cities and the kings taken. So at verse 40, so Joshua conquered all the land, the mountain country in the south, etc., and the lowland. And Joshua conquered them as far as from Kadesh Barnea. Now verse 41 tells us the region. So let's see if we can kind of trace this. We don't have all these cities on the map. Kadesh Barnea is, it would be way down here. I can't get my circle way down there. It won't go that far. But it's on down below. If I was on Kadesh Barnea, you couldn't see my circle. So they got from Kadesh Barnea, and Gaza is right over in this region. So he captured from Kadesh Barnea as far as Gaza, all the country of Goshen, as far as Gibeon. So basically, this whole region that you see on this map from this side of the Dead Sea, he's conquered. Again, not every single village, but every major city was taken. And so what's the point? We'll come to verse 43 to finish up. Joshua returned to, and all Israel with him, to the camp of Gilgal. So that's the end of the southern campaign. So there was the central campaign, and they took the middle section. Now they've taken the southern section. And so next week, chapter 11, we're going to go to the north. And that's what we want to see is that those three campaigns before the land is settled out. So there are three major campaigns, and this was the second. So we get the impression here that, because this is just a brief summary of that maybe these were not as important as, say, taking Jericho. The whole chapter is given to Jericho. 2 chapters are given to Ai. And 1 chapter is given to Gibeon. And so you have about 7 cities here, 7 major cities, that are summed up in 1 chapter. It's not that they're not as important. This is just kind of a summary chapter. Some call chapter 10 and 11 an interlude, and 12 an interlude. And that this is kind of an interlude to pause till we get to chapter 13 a little bit later. All right. We'll stop at that. What we've seen is the conquest of the south. 5 things happen in the chapter. We'll stop at that point. Practical lessons. Let me make sure I've answered all the questions. Question 5 for the graded ages. This chapter deals with Joshua's southern campaign. And I think that finishes all of their questions. 1 question left for the adults. Question number 9. Any practical lessons? One is that there is no need to fear, verse 8, when God's with you. No matter what you're doing, if God's with you and you've got His blessings and His encouragement, there's no need to fear. And we've already mentioned it, verse 14, sometimes there are times that the Lord listens and heeds the voice of man. It was Joshua's thought, sun stand still, and the Lord heeded his voice. And the Lord calls the sun to stand still. All right, we'll stop at that and continue our service with our announcements.